The wind howled like a wild animal across the Arizona desert that February night in 1882. Samuel Morrison pulled his worn coat tighter as he checked on his remaining cattle one last time. The winter had been the worst he'd seen in 20 years of ranching. Snow covered the ground 3 feet deep, and the temperature hadn't risen above freezing in weeks. Sam counted only 43 head of cattle left in the main corral. Just 6 months ago, he'd had over 200. The harsh weather had claimed the rest, along with most of his savings and hope for the future. At 58 years old, he was too proud to quit, but too broke to continue much longer. The bank had already sent 2 letters demanding payment on his loan. The general store in town had cut off his credit. Even his longtime foreman, Joe Murphy, had started talking about finding work elsewhere. "Ain't no shame in admitting defeat, Sam," Joe had said just that morning. "Sometimes a man's got to know when he's beaten." But Sam wasn't ready to give up. This land meant everything to him. He'd built his ranch from nothing after the Civil War, using his army pension and every dollar he could scrape together. The red dirt and desert sky had become his whole world. Losing it would mean losing himself. As he walked back toward the small adobe house he called home, something caught his eye near the front porch. 3 small shapes huddled together against the wooden steps, barely visible in the swirling snow. Sam's first thought was that some of his neighbor's dogs had wandered over looking for shelter. But as he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. They weren't dogs. They were children. 3 young boys, probably no older than 10 or 11, dressed in ragged clothes that offered little protection against the brutal cold. Their dark hair was matted with ice, and their lips had turned blue from the freezing temperatures. Sam recognized immediately that they were Apache children. The ongoing war between the Army and various Apache tribes had made the territory a dangerous place for everyone. Most white settlers viewed any Apache as a potential threat. Just last month, a ranch 30 miles south had been attacked, leaving 2 families dead. His foreman Joe appeared beside him, having heard the commotion. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Joe whispered, then quickly reached for the rifle he always carried. "Step back, Sam, could be a trap. You know how these savages operate." But Sam didn't step back. Instead, he knelt down slowly, making himself less threatening to the frightened boys. Up close, he could see they were half-starved and nearly frozen to death. Their eyes held a look he recognized from his own childhood, the desperate, hollow stare of someone who had nowhere else to turn. Growing up as an orphan on the streets of St. Louis had taught Sam what real hunger and desperation looked like. He remembered sleeping in alleys during winter nights, begging for scraps of food and wondering if anyone in the world cared whether he lived or died. These boys had that same lost look. "They're just children, Joe," Sam said quietly, not taking his eyes off the 3 small figures. "Look at them. They're more scared of us than we are of them." The smallest of the 3 boys tried to stand but immediately collapsed back into the snow. He was clearly the weakest of the group, probably hadn't eaten in days. The other 2 boys moved protectively around him, even though they could barely stand themselves. "Sam, you can't be thinking what I think you're thinking," Joe said, his voice rising with concern. "The whole territory's talking about Apache raids. People are already suspicious of anyone who shows sympathy to them. You bring these boys inside and word will spread faster than wildfire." Sam knew Joe was right about the risks. The territorial governor had recently declared that any Apache found off the reservation could be shot on sight. Most ranchers and townspeople supported this harsh policy, believing it was the only way to ensure their safety. But looking at these 3 children, Sam couldn't see enemies or threats. He saw 3 young boys who would die if someone didn't help them. The moral code his mother had taught him before she died when he was 12 came flooding back. "Samuel, you judge a person by their actions, not their appearance. And you always help those who can't help themselves." "Get the door, Joe," Sam said, gently lifting the smallest boy in his arms. The child was light as a feather, clearly malnourished. "I'm bringing them inside." "Sam, this is madness," Joe protested, but he didn't try to stop him. After working together for 15 years, Joe knew that once Sam Morrison made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. Sam carried the first boy into the warm kitchen, then went back for the other 2. They were so weak they could barely walk, leaning heavily on him as he helped them to chairs near the wood-burning stove. None of them spoke English, but their grateful expressions said everything. He heated up some leftover beef stew and served it to them in small portions, knowing that too much food too quickly could make them sick. The boys ate slowly, cautiously, as if they expected someone to snatch the bowls away at any moment. As they warmed up and got some food in their stomachs, Sam could see they were actually healthy-looking children underneath all the dirt and exhaustion. The smallest one, who seemed to be the leader despite his size, had intelligent eyes that followed Sam's every movement. The middle boy was stockier and had the build of someone who would grow up strong. The tallest was thin but alert, constantly watching the doors and windows as if expecting danger. Joe paced around the kitchen, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sam, what's your plan here? You can't keep them. The law won't allow it, and if word gets out that you're harboring Apache children, every rancher in the territory will turn against you. The bank will foreclose on this place faster than you can blink." Sam poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table across from the three boys. He honestly didn't have a plan. All he knew was that he couldn't turn them back out into the deadly cold. "I suppose I'll figure it out as I go along," he said finally. "First thing is to get them healthy again. Then we'll see what happens next." The smallest boy looked up from his bowl of stew and said something in Apache. While Sam couldn't understand the words, the tone was clearly one of gratitude. "You're welcome, son," Sam replied, knowing the boy probably didn't understand English but hoping his tone would come across as friendly. Outside, the wind continued to howl and snow kept falling. Sam realized he had just made a decision that would change his life forever. He had no idea if it would lead to salvation or disaster, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something right. The three boys finished their stew and looked around uncertainly, probably wondering what would happen to them next. Sam pointed to the small parlor where he had a couch and some blankets. "You can sleep there tonight," he said, gesturing toward the room. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." As he watched the three children settle down for the night, Sam couldn't help but think about the strange turns life takes. 6 hours ago, he thought his biggest problem was saving his ranch. Now he had 3 Apache boys under his roof, and somehow, that seemed to put everything else in perspective. The first few weeks were harder than Sam had imagined. The 3 boys barely spoke, and when they did, it was only to each other in their native Apache language. They jumped at loud noises, flinched whenever Sam moved too quickly, and always sat with their backs to the wall, watching the doors like trapped animals ready to run. Sam learned bits and pieces of their story through simple gestures and the few English words they gradually picked up. Their names were Little Wolf, Standing Bear, and Crow Feather. The cavalry had attacked their camp 3 months earlier. Their parents and most of their family had been killed. They'd been wandering ever since, avoiding both soldiers and settlers, surviving on whatever they could find. Little Wolf, the smallest and youngest, seemed to be the smartest of the 3. He picked up English words faster than his brothers and often served as their spokesman when they needed something. Standing Bear was the middle child, quiet but observant, with natural skill around the horses and cattle. Crow Feather, the tallest, had steady hands and showed interest in how things worked. The pump handle, the stove, even Sam's old pocket watch. The neighbors weren't happy about the arrangement. Word had spread quickly through the small community that Sam Morrison was keeping Apache children on his ranch. Some folks just shook their heads and called him foolish. Others were openly hostile. "You've lost your mind, Morrison," declared Pete Hawkins, who owned the neighboring ranch. He'd ridden over one morning with 2 other ranchers, all of them armed and clearly angry. "Those savages will slit your throat the first chance they get. Then they'll probably burn down half the valley." Sam had met them at the property line, not wanting them near the house where the boys were helping with morning chores. "They're children, Pete. Orphaned children who nearly froze to death." "They're Apache," spat Tom Bradley, the youngest of the 3 visitors. "My cousin was killed by Apaches just last year. You think age matters to them? They're raised from birth to hate whites." "These boys hate nobody," Sam replied calmly. "They're too busy trying to survive." But he knew his words fell on deaf ears. The fear and anger ran too deep. The Apache wars had claimed lives on both sides, leaving wounds that might never heal. Still, Sam refused to turn the boys away. Something about their situation reminded him too much of his own childhood struggles. The boys gradually began to trust Sam, but it happened slowly, in small moments. Little Wolf was the first to smile, when Sam showed him how to read simple words from an old newspaper. Standing Bear warmed up when Sam let him help with the horses, recognizing the boy's natural ability with animals. Crowfeather came around when Sam gave him some broken tools to tinker with, and the boy actually managed to fix an old saddle buckle that had been broken for months. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and bringing new hope to the struggling ranch. The boys proved to be harder workers than Sam had expected. They seemed to understand that their presence put Sam at risk and they wanted to earn their keep. Little Wolf, despite being the smallest, tackled every job with determination. He learned to milk cows, gather eggs, and even help with basic bookkeeping once his English improved enough. His quick mind amazed Sam. The boy could do arithmetic in his head faster than most adults could do it on paper. Standing Bear became Sam's right-hand man with the livestock. He had an almost magical way with horses, able to calm even the most stubborn animals. The cattle seemed to trust him instinctively, and he could spot a sick cow from across the pasture. His quiet nature made him perfect for the patient work that ranch life required. Crowfeather's mechanical skills proved invaluable around the ranch. He fixed the broken windmill that had been out of service for 2 years. He rigged up a better system for the water pump. He even improved the design of the cattle chute, making it easier to handle the animals during branding season. But the outside pressure continued to build. The general store owner refused to sell supplies to Sam if he brought any of the boys to town. The bank manager made pointed comments about Sam's poor judgment affecting his creditworthiness. Even the local preacher suggested that Sam was interfering with God's plan by helping Apache children. The worst incident happened in late March. Sam had taken Little Wolf with him to town to buy supplies, thinking it was time the boy experienced the world beyond the ranch. As they walked past the saloon, 3 drunk cowboys started making loud comments. "Look here, boys," one of them called out. "Morrison's got himself a pet savage. Bet that little redskin knows where the rest of his tribe is hiding," added another. Sam tried to ignore them and keep walking, but the men blocked their path. Little Wolf stayed close to Sam's side, but Sam could feel the boy trembling. "Why don't you hand him over to us, Morrison?" the first cowboy said, his breath reeking of whiskey. "We'll teach him some proper manners." "Step aside," Sam said quietly, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "Or what?" The cowboy laughed. "You'll shoot white men to protect a savage?" The tension was broken when Sheriff Anderson appeared from across the street. He'd been watching the confrontation develop and decided to intervene before it got out of hand. "That's enough, boys," the sheriff said firmly. "Morrison's not breaking any laws, and neither is the boy. Move along before I decide you're disturbing the peace." The cowboys grumbled but backed down. Sheriff Anderson was known for his fairness but also for his quick action when trouble started. After they left, the sheriff pulled Sam aside. "I respect what you're doing, Sam, but you need to be careful. Feelings are running high these days. Some folks won't be satisfied with just words." On the ride back to the ranch, Little Wolf was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke up in his careful English. "Why do they hate us so much?" Sam considered the question carefully. Fear mostly. People are afraid of what they don't understand. There's been a lot of fighting and killing on both sides. Some folks think all Apaches are the same. "Are we safe with you?" Little Wolf asked. Sam looked at the serious young face beside him. "As long as I'm alive, nobody will hurt you boys. That's a promise." That evening, Sam found the 3 brothers talking quietly in Apache on the front porch. When they saw him, they switched to English. "We bring trouble for you," Standing Bear said. "Maybe we should go." Sam sat down in his rocking chair and studied their faces. These boys had become like sons to him over the past few months, though he'd been afraid to admit it even to himself. "This is your home now," he said simply. "Family doesn't abandon family just because times get tough." Little Wolf looked up with tears in his eyes. "Family?" "Family," Sam confirmed. It was the first time any of them had used that word, but somehow it felt right. They weren't connected by blood, but they'd been forged together by hardship and mutual dependence. Sam had given them a home when they had nowhere else to go. In return, they'd given him a purpose beyond just surviving from day to day. That night, as Sam listened to the boys settling down in their beds, he realized something had changed. For the first time since the harsh winter began, he wasn't thinking about losing the ranch. Instead, he was thinking about the future, about teaching the boys to read and write, about watching them grow into men, about building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. The ranch was still struggling financially, and the neighbors were still hostile. But Sam had something now that he'd never had before. A family worth fighting for. 7 years had passed since that snowy night when 3 frightened Apache boys had appeared at Sam Morrison's door. Now, in the spring of 1889, they had grown into young men who barely resembled the starving children he'd once sheltered. Little Wolf, now 18, had shot up tall and lean, but his mind had grown even more than his body. He devoured every book Sam could find, from law texts to Shakespeare to political essays. His English had become perfect, with barely a trace of accent, and he could write better than most college graduates. More importantly, he had developed dreams that seemed impossible for an Apache in Arizona territory. "I want to be a lawyer," he announced one evening over dinner, causing Sam's fork to stop halfway to his mouth. Standing Bear, now 19 and built like a bull, chuckled at his younger brother's ambition. "And I suppose you'll argue cases in front of judges who think we should all be on reservations?" "That's exactly what I'll do," Little Wolf replied with determination. "Someone has to speak for our people in their courts. Someone who understands both worlds." Crow Feather, the oldest at 20, was more practical in his interests. He'd become fascinated with the new machinery appearing throughout the territory. Steam engines, mining equipment, the telegraph lines being strung between towns. Anything mechanical drew his attention like iron to a magnet. The Morrison Ranch had prospered with their help. What had once been a failing operation now ran like a well-oiled machine. Standing Bear had developed the cattle herd into one of the finest in the territory, with animals that were healthier and more productive than any of their neighbors. Crow Feather had improved nearly every piece of equipment on the ranch, from water pumps to wagons to the branding operation. But their success brought new problems. The better the ranch did, the more attention they attracted. And most of that attention wasn't welcome. "It ain't natural," complained Pete Hawkins at the monthly cattlemen's meeting. "Morrison's got those Apache boys doing the work of grown men, and he's paying them like family. It's giving the other Indians ideas about being equal to whites." The territorial authorities had started asking questions too. An Indian agent named William Crawford made regular visits, ostensibly to check on the boys' welfare, but really to gather information about their activities and attitudes. "The government's position is clear," Crawford explained during one of his visits. "All Apache individuals should be on reservations where they can be properly supervised. These boys have been living outside the system for too long." Sam met Crawford's steely gaze without flinching. "These boys are American citizens, same as anyone else. They work hard, pay their taxes, and cause no trouble. What more do you want?" "I want them where they belong," Crawford replied. "With their own people, learning to accept their proper place in society." The conversation grew more tense when Crawford met with the 3 young men individually. Little Wolf's ambitions particularly bothered him. "A lawyer?" Crawford scoffed. "Young man, you need to understand your limitations. The Apache people are meant to be craftsmen, laborers, perhaps farmers. Professional careers are not appropriate for your race." Little Wolf listened politely, but Sam could see the fire burning in his eyes. That evening, he found the young man sitting alone on the porch, staring at the sunset. "He's wrong, you know," Sam said, settling into the rocking chair beside him. "Is he?" Little Wolf asked quietly. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon. Maybe I'm reaching too high. Maybe I should be satisfied with what I have here." "Your mother didn't think you were reaching too high when she taught you Apache law and tradition," Sam replied. "Your grandfather didn't think so when he trained you to be a leader among your people. Why should this Crawford fellow's opinion matter more than theirs?" Little Wolf was quiet for a long moment. "Because he represents the world I want to enter. If men like him won't accept me, how can I succeed?" "By being better than them," Sam said simply. "By knowing more, working harder, and proving them wrong every single day." The pressure wasn't just coming from outside the ranch. Within the Apache, community opinions were divided about the 3 young men. Some saw them as sellouts who had abandoned their people for the comfort of white society. Others viewed them as potential bridges between 2 worlds. Greyhawk, an elder from the nearby reservation, visited one autumn evening. He spoke with the three brothers in Apache for over an hour, while Sam respectfully stayed inside the house. Later, Standing Bear explained what the old man had said. He says we walk between two worlds but belong to neither. The whites will never fully accept us because of our blood. The Apache will never trust us because of how we live. What do you think? Sam asked. Standing Bear looked troubled. I think maybe he's right, but I also think it's too late to go back. This ranch, this life, it's who we are now. Crow Feather nodded in agreement. The reservation isn't home to us anymore. We've changed too much. But Little Wolf wasn't ready to accept that they were caught between worlds. Maybe we don't have to choose sides. Maybe we can help both sides understand each other. His optimism was tested when violence erupted that winter. A group of Apache warriors, frustrated with conditions on the reservation, broke out and began raiding isolated ranches. The territorial militia was called out, and tensions reached their highest point since the boys had arrived at the Morrison Ranch. One night, a group of armed men surrounded the ranch house. Sam recognized several neighbors, including Pete Hawkins, but many were strangers, probably militia volunteers from other areas. Morrison, Hawkins called out. We know you've got Apache on your property. Hand them over and nobody gets hurt. Sam stepped onto the porch, his rifle in his hands. Behind him, he could sense the three young men taking positions at the windows, though he'd told them to stay inside. These boys have nothing to do with the raiders, Sam called back. They've been here for 7 years working this ranch and minding their own business. Apache is Apache, shouted one of the strangers. They're all in contact with each other. These boys probably know exactly where the raiders are hiding. Even if they did, Sam replied, they're under my protection. Anyone who wants to take them will have to go through me first. The standoff lasted nearly an hour. Sam could feel sweat running down his back despite the cold night air. He was outnumbered 10-1 and some of these men looked ready to start shooting. Finally, Sheriff Anderson arrived with 2 deputies. He'd received word about the confrontation and ridden out from town as fast as he could. That's enough, the sheriff announced, riding his horse between Sam and the armed group. I know these boys personally. They've never caused trouble, never broken any laws. If you men want to hunt raiders, go hunt raiders, but you're not taking innocent people. The crowd grumbled and argued, but eventually they dispersed. Sheriff E. Anderson was respected throughout the territory, and most people knew he wouldn't take a stand unless he was certain of his position. After everyone left, Sam found the 3 brothers in the kitchen cleaning their weapons. They'd been ready to fight for their home and their family. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Sam said. Little Wolf looked up from his rifle. We knew this day would come. We've been living on borrowed time. No, Sam said firmly. You've been living on earned time. You've worked for everything you have here. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. But the incident had shaken all of them. The outside world was becoming increasingly hostile, and Sam realized that his ability to protect the boys was limited. They were young men now, capable of making their own decisions about their futures. The conversation he'd been dreading finally came a few weeks later. I've been thinking about what you said, Little Wolf told him. About being better than them, proving them wrong every day, and I want to go east, to law school. If I'm going to be a lawyer, I need proper education. Sam felt his heart sink, but he tried not to show it. That's a big step. It would mean leaving Arizona, probably for years. I know, and I know it might not work, but I have to try. Standing Bear had been thinking too. I've been talking with Greyhawk and some of the other elders. They want me to come back to the reservation to help bridge the gap between the old ways and the new. Only Crow Feather seemed content to stay. This ranch is my home. The work here is what I love. If you'll have me, I'd like to remain and help you keep this place running. Sam looked at these 3 young men who had become his sons in everything but blood. He was proud of them beyond words, but he also knew that their paths were leading away from the safety of the ranch. You boys have grown up to be everything I hoped you'd become, he said quietly. Whatever you decide to do, you'll have my support and my love. As spring arrived in 1890, Sam realized that the easy years were ending. The three Apache boys who had sought shelter at his door were now men with dreams and ambitions that would take them into a world that might not be ready to accept them. But he had raised them to be strong, smart, and determined. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sam believed they were ready to face them. The morning Little Wolf left for Boston in September 1895 was one of the hardest days of Sam Morrison's life. The young man stood at the train station in Tucson, dressed in his best suit, carrying a single trunk containing everything he owned. His acceptance letter to Harvard Law School was folded carefully in his coat pocket, a miracle that had taken months of correspondence and the personal recommendation of a territorial judge who respected Sam's character. "Remember what I taught you about reading people," Sam said, gripping Little Wolf's shoulder. "Not everyone back east will be as straightforward as folks here in Arizona. Some will smile to your face while planning to stab you in the back." Little Wolf nodded, trying to hide his nervousness behind a confident smile. "I'll write every week, and I'll make you proud. You already have, son." Standing Bear had left 3 months earlier, but his departure had been quieter, more conflicted. Greyhawk and the other reservation elders had convinced him that his people needed young leaders who understood both Apache traditions and white society. The reservation was struggling with poverty, disease, and despair. Young men like Standing Bear could help their people adapt to the changing world while preserving their culture. "I feel like I'm abandoning my real family for a family I barely remember," Standing Bear had confessed the night before he left. "You're not abandoning anyone," Sam had assured him. "You're expanding your family to include people who need your help. That's what good men do." Now, with both younger brothers gone, only Crow Feather remained at the ranch with Sam. At 26, Crow Feather had grown into a quiet, reliable man whose mechanical skills had become legendary throughout the territory. He could fix anything with moving parts and had invented several improvements to mining and ranching equipment that other men were starting to copy. The ranch should have been peaceful with just the two of them, but new troubles were brewing. The copper mining boom had reached their part of Arizona territory, and mining companies were scouting every piece of land that might contain valuable ore. Harrison Copper Company had sent representatives to visit Sam 3 times in the past 6 months, each time making increasingly generous offers for his land. The latest offer was enough money to buy a small ranch in California and live comfortably for the rest of his life. "Think about it, Morrison," urged James Patterson, the company's chief negotiator, during his most recent visit. "You're not getting any younger. Wouldn't you rather spend your golden years in comfort instead of breaking your back on this desert ranch?" Sam had politely declined each offer, but he could see that Patterson was losing patience. The man's tone had grown more aggressive with each visit, and he'd started making veiled threats about what might happen to ranchers who stood in the way of progress. "The territorial government supports mining development," Patterson had said during their last meeting. "Companies like ours bring jobs and prosperity to the territory. Officials tend to look favorably on communities that cooperate with that development." Sam understood the implication. The mining company had political connections that could make life difficult for an uncooperative rancher. But this land represented everything he'd worked for over the past 30 years. More importantly, it was the only home the 3 boys had ever known as a family. He couldn't sell their birthright to a mining company. The pressure increased when several of Sam's neighbors decided to sell their ranches to Harrison Copper. Pete Hawkins was the first to go, accepting an offer that was reportedly 3 times what his ranch was actually worth. "You'd be smart to follow my lead, Morrison," Hawkins said when he stopped by to say goodbye. "These mining folks have deep pockets now, but that might not last forever. Better to take their money while they're still offering it." Tom Bradley sold out 2 weeks later, followed by the Wilson family and then the Rodriguezes. Within 6 months, Sam's ranch was surrounded by mining claims and equipment. The quiet desert valley he'd called home for decades was rapidly becoming an industrial landscape of mine shafts, processing facilities, and worker camps. The transformation brought new problems. The mining operations contaminated the water supply, making it dangerous for cattle to drink from several streams and natural springs. The constant blasting and heavy machinery scared the wildlife and disrupted the natural patterns that Sam's cattle had depended on for generations. Worse yet, the influx of miners and company officials had changed the political landscape of the entire region. The territorial legislature passed new laws making it easier for mining companies to claim private land for public development projects. Local sheriffs and judges found themselves under pressure to support mining interests over individual property rights. Meanwhile, Little Wolf's letters from Boston painted a picture of a different kind of struggle. Harvard Law School had accepted him, but that didn't mean his fellow students or professors welcomed him. He was the only Native American in his class, and many people made it clear they thought he didn't belong there. "The professors are fair, mostly," he wrote in one letter. "They judge my work by the same standards they use for everyone else. But some of my classmates act like I'm an exotic animal in a zoo. They ask me questions about scalping and war paint as if every Apache spends his time raiding wagon trains." Despite the social challenges, Little Wolf was excelling academically. His letters mentioned high marks in constitutional law, property rights, and legal writing. He'd even been selected to participate in a prestigious moot court competition during his second year. Standing Bear's situation on the reservation was more complicated. His letters were less frequent and more guarded, but Sam could read between the lines. The young man was struggling to balance his loyalty to Apache traditions with his desire to help his people adapt to the modern world. "Some of the elders think I've been corrupted by white education," Standing Bear wrote. "They say I've forgotten how to be Apache. But when I suggest using modern farming techniques or negotiating better terms with the Indian Agency, they accuse me of abandoning our ancestors' wisdom." The reservation was also dealing with outside pressure from mining companies. Harrison Copper had discovered that some of the richest ore deposits in the region lay beneath reservation land. They were lobbying the federal government to reduce the reservation's boundaries or relocate the Apache to less valuable territory. In the spring of 1897, Sam received disturbing news from both of his absent sons. Little Wolf wrote that federal agents had visited Harvard, asking questions about his background and political activities. They seemed particularly interested in whether he maintained contact with Apache groups that might be planning resistance activities. Around the same time, Standing Bear sent word that several young Apache men had been arrested on suspicion of planning raids against mining operations. The evidence was thin, but tensions on the reservation were rising as more families were forced to relocate to make room for mining surveys. Sam began to realize that the problems facing his ranch were part of a larger pattern. Mining companies weren't just targeting individual properties. They were systematically working to remove any obstacles to their expansion, whether those obstacles were uncooperative ranchers or inconvenient Native American communities. The situation came to a head in late summer when Harris and Copper made their final offer. Patterson arrived at the ranch with two other men, both wearing badges that identified them as territorial marshals. "Morrison, you're the last holdout in this entire valley," Patterson said without preamble. "Every other rancher has seen reason and accepted our generous terms. I'm authorized to offer you 50% more than we paid anyone else, but this is absolutely our final offer." Sam studied the three men carefully. The marshals had their hands resting casually on their gun butts, not quite threatening, but definitely sending a message. "And if I decline?" Sam asked. "Then we'll have to pursue other options," Patterson replied smoothly. "The territorial government has the authority to claim private property for essential development projects. Of course, in those cases, compensation is determined by government appraisers rather than private negotiation. The amounts tend to be much lower." Sam felt Crowfeather tense beside him. The young man understood the threat as clearly as Sam did. "I need time to think about it," Sam said finally. "You have 1 week," Patterson replied. "After that, we'll assume you're not interested in reasonable cooperation." That evening, Sam and Crowfeather discussed their options. The young man was ready to fight, but Sam knew that wouldn't solve anything. They were facing an enemy with unlimited resources and government backing. "Maybe we should contact Little Wolf," Crowfeather suggested. "He's studying law. Maybe he knows some legal way to stop them." Sam shook his head. "He's got enough problems of his own right now. Besides, this isn't a legal problem, it's a political one. And we don't have any political friends." As the week deadline approached, Sam realized he was facing the same kind of impossible choice that had confronted the Apache people for generations. He could fight and almost certainly lose everything. Or he could surrender and try to preserve something from the wreckage. But then he remembered something Little Wolf had said before leaving for law school. "Sometimes the best way to win a war is to change the battlefield." The murder happened on a cold October night in 1898, just 2 miles from Sam Morrison's ranch house. Charles Brennan, the chief surveyor for Harrison Copper Company, was found dead beside his wagon with a bullet through his chest. His horse was still hitched and calm, suggesting the killer had been someone the animal knew and trusted. Sheriff Anderson arrived at Sam's ranch before dawn, his face grim with the kind of expression that meant serious trouble. "Sam, I need to ask you some questions about last night," the sheriff said, declining the offered cup of coffee. "Where were you between 8 and 10 o'clock? Sam felt his stomach drop. "Right here, fixing a broken harness with crow feather." "Why, what's happened?" "Charles Brennan's been killed. Shot once through the heart at close range. His body was found on the road between your place and town." Crow Feather appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation. "We worked on that harness until almost 11 o'clock. Sam never left the ranch." Sheriff Anderson nodded, but Sam could see something troubled in his eyes. "I believe you boys, but I've got to tell you, this doesn't look good." Brennan had been asking around town about the best ways to force stubborn ranchers off their land. Folks know he'd been pressuring you to sell. Over the next few days, more details emerged that painted an increasingly dark picture for Sam. Witnesses came forward claiming they'd heard him make threats against Brennan during their last meeting. A shopkeeper in town swore he'd sold Sam ammunition just days before the murder. Most damaging of all, someone found one of Sam's old rifle shells near the crime scene. "It's too convenient," Crow Feather said as they discussed the mounting evidence. "Someone's working hard to make you look guilty," Sam agreed, but he couldn't prove it. The evidence against him was thin but consistent, like someone had carefully planned each piece to build a case. The problem was that in a territory where mining companies wielded enormous influence, thin evidence might be enough to secure a conviction. The situation worsened when James Patterson arrived at the ranch with a new offer. The mining company executive seemed surprisingly sympathetic about Sam's legal troubles. "Terrible business, this murder," Patterson said, shaking his head sadly. "I hope Sheriff Anderson catches the real killer soon. Of course, legal troubles can be expensive, can't they? Court costs, lawyer fees, they add up quickly." Sam studied Patterson's face, looking for some sign of the man's real intentions. "What are you getting at?" "Just that Harrison Copper Company has always been willing to help members of our community during difficult times. If you were to reconsider our offer on this property, we might be able to provide some assistance with your legal expenses. Good lawyers are expensive, but they're often the difference between freedom and prison." The implied threat was clear: sell the ranch or face murder charges without adequate legal representation. Sam politely declined the offer, but he could see that Patterson hadn't expected any other answer. Things moved quickly after that. Within a week, the territorial prosecutor announced that charges would be filed against Sam Morrison for the murder of Charles Brennan. The evidence was circumstantial, but the prosecutor, a young man named David Walsh who'd only recently arrived from back east, seemed confident of securing a conviction. The defendant had clear motive to kill the victim, Walsh told the local newspaper. Brennan represented the progress and development that Morrison opposed. When legal pressure failed to move Morrison off his land, he resorted to violence. Sam hired the best lawyer he could afford, a grizzled old attorney named Robert Kane, who'd been practicing in the territory for over 20 years. Kane was honest about their chances. "The evidence is weak, but it's consistent," Kane explained during their first meeting. "More importantly, the political winds are blowing against us. Mining companies have a lot of influence in this territory right now. Judges and juries tend to side with business interests over individual ranchers." Kane did his best, but as the trial approached, key witnesses began changing their stories or disappearing altogether. A ranch hand who'd been willing to testify that he'd seen suspicious men near the crime scene suddenly left town for family reasons. A store clerk who could have provided Sam with an alibi decided he wasn't certain about the timing of Sam's visit after all. Meanwhile, new witnesses appeared with damaging testimony. A traveling salesman claimed he'd overheard Sam threatening Brennan in a saloon. A mining company employee swore he'd seen Sam riding toward town on the night of the murder. Each new witness made Sam's situation more precarious. Crow Feather worked desperately to find evidence that might clear Sam's name. He rode out to the crime scene repeatedly, searching for clues that the sheriff's investigation might have missed. He questioned everyone in town, looking for someone who might have seen the real killer, but his efforts seemed to hit dead ends at every turn. "It's like fighting shadows," Crow Feather told Sam one evening. "Every time I think I've found something, it disappears or turns out to be false. The trial began on a Monday morning in November 1898. The courthouse was packed with curious townspeople, mining company officials, and newspaper reporters who'd come to cover the sensational case of the rancher who'd allegedly murdered a mining executive. Prosecutor Walsh painted Sam as a desperate man driven to violence by his refusal to accept the changing times. The defendant represents the old frontier mentality that believes problems can be solved with guns rather than law, Walsh told the jury. Charles Brennan was simply doing his job when Morrison decided to silence him permanently. Robert Kane fought back with everything he had, pointing out the gaps and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, but Sam could see from the jurors' faces that they were inclined to believe the worst. Several were employed by mining companies themselves. Others were newcomers to the territory who viewed old-time ranchers with suspicion. The most damaging testimony came from Jake Wilson, a drifter who claimed he'd been camping near the crime scene on the night of the murder. Wilson swore he'd seen Sam Morrison shoot Charles Brennan in cold blood, then ride away without checking to see if his victim was dead. "I was afraid to come forward at first," Wilson testified, wringing his hat in his hands. "Morrison's got a reputation as a hard man, and I didn't want to cross him. But I couldn't let an innocent man's murder go unpunished." During cross-examination, Kane tried to discredit Wilson's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies in his story and questioning his motives for waiting so long to come forward, but the damage was done. The jury had heard an eyewitness account of the murder, and Wilson had been a convincing witness. As the trial progressed, Sam realized he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. The evidence against him had been too carefully constructed, the witness testimony too well coordinated. Someone had spent months building an airtight case, and that someone had resources and influence far beyond anything Sam could match. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Judge Harrison, no relation to the mining company, but clearly sympathetic to business interests, sentenced Sam Morrison to death by hanging. "The court finds that the defendant committed a cowardly and premeditated murder," Judge Harrison declared. "Such acts of violence against innocent men cannot be tolerated in a civilized territory. The sentence will be carried out 1 week from today at dawn." Sam sat in his jail cell that night, trying to come to terms with the fact that he would probably die for a crime he hadn't committed. Crowfeather visited, bringing news that he'd sent urgent letters to both Little Wolf and Standing Bear. But there was no guarantee the messages would reach them in time. "I should have seen this coming," Sam said quietly. "They needed me out of the way, so they manufactured a reason to remove me." "It's not over yet," Crowfeather insisted. "Little Wolf will know what to do. He's been studying law for 3 years now. If anyone can find a way to save you, it's him." But privately, Sam wasn't sure that even Little Wolf's legal education would be enough to overcome the powerful forces aligned against them. The mining company had played their hand expertly, using the legal system itself as a weapon to achieve their goals. As he lay on his narrow cot, listening to the sounds of the night outside his cell window, Sam thought about the 3 Apache boys who had changed his life so many years ago. He'd tried to give them a home and a future, but now it looked like his efforts would end with his own execution. Still, he didn't regret his choices. The boys had grown into good men who would find their own ways in the world. That was worth more than any ranch or any amount of money. But deep down, Sam hoped that somehow, some way, the family he'd created would find a way to save him from the trap that had been so carefully laid. The telegram reached Little Wolf on a Thursday afternoon, as he sat in the Harvard Law Library, preparing for his final examinations. The message was brief but devastating. Sam arrested for murder. Trial ended. Guilty verdict. Execution set for Monday dawn. Come immediately. Crowfeather. Little Wolf read the telegram 3 times before the words fully sank in. Sam Morrison, the man who had saved his life and raised him as a son, was going to be executed in 4 days for a crime that Little Wolf instinctively knew he hadn't committed. Professor Williams, his constitutional law instructor, found him 20 minutes later, still sitting in the same chair with the telegram clutched in his trembling hands. "Mr. Little Wolf, you look like you've seen a ghost. Is everything all right?" Little Wolf looked up at the elderly professor who had become something of a mentor during his 3 years at Harvard. Professor Williams was one of the few faculty members who had treated him as an equal from the beginning. never questioning his right to be there or his ability to succeed. "My father is going to be executed on Monday," Little Wolf said quietly. "He's been framed for murder by a mining company that wants his land." Professor Williams sat down beside him. "Your father? I thought you were orphaned as a child." "The man who raised me. The man who gave me this opportunity." Little Wolf held up the telegram. "I have to go home immediately, but your examinations are next week. You've worked 3 years for this degree. If you leave now..." "Then I leave now," Little Wolf said, standing up. "Some things are more important than degrees." Professor Williams studied the young man's face and saw a determination that reminded him of the best trial lawyers he'd known. "What can you do? You haven't passed the bar examination yet. You can't practice law in Arizona territory." "I'll find a way," Little Wolf replied. "I have to." The journey from Boston to Arizona territory normally took 6 days by train, but Little Wolf managed to cut that time to 4.5 by catching express connections and paying extra for the fastest routes available. He spent the entire trip studying every legal text he'd brought with him, reviewing everything he'd learned about criminal procedure, constitutional law, and appeals processes. More importantly, he spent the time thinking about the situation from every angle. A mining company powerful enough to orchestrate a frame-up wouldn't have left obvious loopholes in their plan. The evidence against Sam would be convincing, the witnesses carefully coached, the legal procedures followed to the letter. Beating them would require finding something they hadn't anticipated. He arrived in Tucson on Saturday evening, less than 36 hours before Sam's scheduled execution. Crow Feather was waiting at the train station, looking older and more worried than Little Wolf had ever seen him. "Thank God you made it," Crow Feather said, embracing his younger brother. "I wasn't sure the telegram would reach you in time." "Tell me everything," Little Wolf said as they rode toward the jail. Every detail of the trial, every piece of evidence, every witness. Crow Feather had kept detailed notes throughout the proceedings, knowing that Little Wolf would want to understand exactly what had happened. As they talked, Little Wolf began to see the pattern of the frame-up more clearly. "It's too perfect," he said finally. "Real murders are messy, with contradictory evidence and unreliable witnesses. This case has been constructed like a legal brief. Every piece of evidence supports the same conclusion." They reached the jail just as visiting hours were ending, but Sheriff Anderson made an exception when he recognized Little Wolf. "Heard you were back east studying law," the sheriff said. "Wish you were here under better circumstances." Little Wolf found Sam sitting calmly on his cot, reading a well-worn copy of the Bible. The older man looked up and smiled when he saw his adopted son. "You came," Sam said simply. "Of course I came." Little Wolf sat down on the small stool next to the cell. "Now tell me what really happened." Sam recounted the events leading up to his arrest, the pressure from the mining company, and the mounting evidence that had appeared against him. Little Wolf listened carefully, asking detailed questions about timing, witnesses, and legal procedures. "The lawyer they gave me did his best," Sam said, "but the deck was stacked against us from the beginning. The prosecutor had answers for everything we threw at them." "What about appeals?" Little Wolf asked. "Robert Kane filed the paperwork, but the Territorial Supreme Court won't hear the case for another 6 months. The execution is scheduled for Monday morning." Little Wolf felt his heart sink. In all his legal studies, he'd learned that the appeals process was designed to be thorough, not fast. There was no mechanism for stopping an execution on such short notice unless new evidence could prove the condemned man's innocence beyond any doubt. That night, Little Wolf met with Robert Kane, Sam's defense attorney. Kane was a competent lawyer, but he was clearly exhausted and discouraged by his defeat. "I've been practicing law in this territory for 20 years, Kane said. "I've never seen a case where the evidence appeared so systematically and conveniently. But I couldn't prove it was manufactured, and the jury believed what they saw." "What about the key witness, this Jake Wilson, who claimed he saw the murder? Disappeared right after the trial. Left town and nobody knows where he went. Even if we could find him, his testimony was very convincing." The jury believed him completely. Little Wolf spent the rest of the night reviewing Kane's trial notes and talking with Crow Feather about every detail they could remember. By Sunday morning, he had identified several potential weaknesses in the prosecution's case, but nothing strong enough to overturn a conviction on such short notice. The breakthrough came when Crow Feather mentioned something that had been bothering him throughout the trial. That witness, Jake Wilson, There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it at the time. Now I remember where I've seen him before. Where? About 6 months ago, I saw him talking with James Patterson from the mining company behind the hotel in town. They were having what looked like a serious conversation, very private-like. Little Wolf felt a surge of hope. If Wilson had been in contact with mining company officials before the murder, it would suggest that his testimony had been arranged in advance. But proving it would be nearly impossible with less than 24 hours remaining. "We need to find Wilson," Little Wolf said. "I told you, he disappeared right after the trial. People don't just disappear. They go somewhere. And if the mining company paid him to give false testimony, they might have paid him to stay hidden until after the execution." Little Wolf and Crow Feather spent Sunday afternoon questioning everyone in town who might have information about Wilson's whereabouts. Most people claimed they'd never heard of him, but a few remembered seeing him around town during the weeks before the trial. The bartender at the Silver Dollar Saloon provided their first real lead. "Yeah, I remember that fellow. Quiet type, kept to himself mostly. But I saw him talking with some mining company boys a few times. They seemed real friendly. Bought him quite a few drinks." A hotel clerk remembered that Wilson had paid his bill in cash. Unusual for a drifter who claimed to be broke. "Had a roll of bills thick as my thumb," the clerk recalled. More money than most working men see in a year. By Sunday evening, Little Wolf had established a pattern that suggested Wilson had been in contact with mining company officials and had received substantial payments from unknown sources. But it was still circumstantial evidence, and he had no way to present it to a court before Monday morning. That's when Standing Bear arrived. Little Wolf's older brother had ridden hard from the reservation, covering the distance in record time after receiving Crow Feather's urgent message. He brought news that changed everything. "I know where Wilson is," Standing Bear announced. "He's been hiding at a mining camp about 30 miles north of here. Some of my Apache friends have been keeping an eye on him, wondering why a white man would be living in such an isolated place." "Can you get to him?" Little Wolf asked. "Already have. He's drunk most of the time now, spending that mining company money on whiskey and cards. But he's scared too. Keeps talking about how he never meant for an innocent man to hang." Little Wolf felt his pulse quicken. A guilty conscience might be exactly what they needed. "We need to get him to confess," Little Wolf said. "Tonight. Before the execution tomorrow morning." Standing Bear nodded grimly. "That's what I figured you'd say. I've got horses ready outside town, but it's going to be dangerous." The mining company has guards watching the camp. As the three brothers prepared for what might be their most important mission, Little Wolf thought about how far they'd all come from that snowy night 16 years ago, when 3 starving Apache children had appeared at Sam Morrison's door. Now they were men, using every skill Sam had taught them and every advantage their unique backgrounds provided. If they succeeded, they might save the life of the man who had made their own lives possible. If they failed, Sam Morrison would die at dawn, and the mining company would finally have the victory they'd worked so hard to achieve. The mining camp sat in a narrow canyon 30 miles northeast of town, hidden from casual travelers by rocky outcroppings and desert scrub. As the 3 brothers approached on horseback in the darkness, they could see the flickering light of campfires and hear the rough voices of men who lived hard lives far from civilization. Little Wolf checked his pocket watch by moonlight. It was nearly midnight, giving them less than 6 hours before Sam's scheduled execution. Everything had to work perfectly, or they would lose their last chance to save him. "Wilson's in the 3rd tent from the left," Standing Bear whispered, pointing toward a cluster of canvas shelters near the main camp. "He's been drinking heavily all evening, but he's not passed out yet. 2 mining company guards are stationed at the camp entrance, but they're not expecting trouble." Little Wolf had spent the ride thinking about how to approach Wilson. A direct confrontation might cause the man to panic and refuse to cooperate, but they needed more than just a confession. They needed evidence that would stand up in court and convince Judge Harrison to halt the execution. Crow Feather, "Can you create a distraction to draw the guards away from the camp?" Little Wolf asked. His older brother nodded. "Give me 10 minutes to get into position. When you hear rocks falling from the ridge above the camp, that'll be your signal." Crow Feather disappeared into the darkness, with the silent grace he'd learned during his childhood in the wilderness. Standing Bear and Little Wolf waited tensely, knowing that their next few hours would determine whether Sam Morrison lived or died. The distraction came exactly when promised. A cascade of rocks tumbled down the hillside above the mining camp, making enough noise to wake half the men and send the guards running to investigate what they assumed was a potential rockslide threatening their operation. In the confusion, Little Wolf and Standing Bear slipped into the camp and made their way to Wilson's tent. They found him sitting on a camp chair outside his shelter, drinking whiskey straight from a bottle and staring at the stars with the unfocused gaze of a man trying to drown his conscience. "Evening, Wilson," Little Wolf said quietly, stepping into the circle of light cast by the man's campfire. Wilson spun around, nearly dropping his whiskey bottle. When he saw Little Wolf's face, his expression changed from surprise to fear. "You're one of Morrison's boys," Wilson said, his words slurred by alcohol. "The one who went east to study law." "That's right. And you're the man whose testimony is going to get my father executed in the morning." Wilson took another long drink from his bottle, avoiding Little Wolf's steady gaze. "Don't know what you're talking about. I just told the truth about what I saw." Standing Bear stepped out of the shadows and Wilson's fear deepened. The Apache warrior's presence was intimidating even to men who weren't carrying the weight of a guilty conscience. "We know you were paid to lie," Little Wolf said calmly. "We know you met with James Patterson and other mining company officials before the murder even happened. We know they gave you enough money to live comfortably for years." Wilson's hand trembled as he raised the bottle to his lips again. "You can't prove nothing. I gave my testimony in court, and the jury believed me." "The jury believed a lie," Standing Bear said quietly. "And tomorrow morning, a good man dies because of that lie." Little Wolf sat down on a rock across from Wilson, making himself less threatening while maintaining eye contact. His years of legal training had taught him how to read people, and he could see that Wilson was struggling with guilt and fear in equal measure. "I'm not here to threaten you," Little Wolf said. "I'm here to offer you a chance to do the right thing before it's too late." "The right thing?" Wilson laughed bitterly. "You think I wanted to lie in court? You think I wanted to help them frame an innocent man? Then why did you do it?" Wilson was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if looking for answers in the dancing flames. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They said Morrison killed Brennan and they just needed someone to testify about it. Said they had all kinds of evidence proving he was guilty. But they needed an eyewitness to make sure the jury convicted him." "But you didn't actually see the murder, did you?" "I wasn't even in the territory when it happened," Wilson admitted. "I was up in Colorado working a mining claim that went bust. Didn't arrive here until 3 days after Brennan was killed." Little Wolf felt a surge of hope. Wilson's admission was exactly what they needed, but getting him to repeat it in court would be the real challenge. "Who approached you about testifying?" Little Wolf asked. "Patterson himself. Found me in a saloon in Denver. Said he'd heard I was down on my luck and looking for work. Offered me $500 to come to Arizona and tell a simple story about what I'd supposedly seen. $500 was more money than most working men earned in 2 years. For a desperate drifter like Wilson, it would have seemed like a fortune." "Did Patterson tell you who really killed Brennan?" Wilson shook his head. "Said it didn't matter. Said Morrison was a troublemaker who'd been causing problems for legitimate business interests and it was time someone dealt with him." Standing Bear leaned forward. "Do you understand what you've done? An innocent man is going to die because of your lies." "I know," Wilson shouted, then immediately lowered his voice when he realized how loud he'd been. "You think I don't know? You think I've been able to sleep since the trial ended? I see Morrison's face every time I close my eyes." Little Wolf could see that Wilson was on the edge of a complete breakdown. The guilt was eating him alive, but fear of the mining company's retribution was keeping him from coming forward. "It's not too late to make this right," Little Wolf said gently. "You can still save his life. And get myself killed in the process? You think Patterson's going to let me walk away after confessing to perjury? I'd be dead before sunset." "Not if you're under federal protection," Little Wolf said. "I have contacts in the Justice Department from my time at Harvard. Men who are interested in stopping the kind of corruption that's taking over this territory." It wasn't entirely true. Little Wolf knew a few law professors who had connections in Washington, but he had no idea whether they could actually provide protection for a witness like Wilson. But he needed to give the man hope that confession wouldn't automatically mean death. Wilson considered this for several minutes, alternating between sips of whiskey and long stares at the fire. Finally, he looked up at Little Wolf with eyes that held a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "What exactly are you asking me to do? Come back to town with us. Tell Judge Harrison the truth about your testimony. Sign a sworn statement admitting that you lied during the trial. And then what? You think the judge will just let Morrison walk free based on my word? I think Judge Harrison is an honest man who doesn't want an innocent man's blood on his hands," Little Wolf replied. "When he hears your confession and sees the evidence of the mining company's involvement, he'll have to postpone the execution pending a full investigation." Wilson finished the last of his whiskey and threw the empty bottle into the darkness beyond their campfire. "Patterson's not going to let this happen. He's got too much invested in getting Morrison out of the way. Patterson's not here," Standing Bear pointed out, "and by the time he finds out what's happened, it'll be too late to stop it." Crow Feather appeared at the edge of their campfire, materializing from the shadows as silently as he'd left. "We need to go," he said urgently. "The guards are heading back to camp, and some of the miners are starting to wonder what caused that rock slide." Little Wolf stood up and extended his hand to Wilson. "This is your last chance to do the right thing. Help us save an innocent man's life." Wilson stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and grasped it. "God help me," he whispered. "I hope I don't regret this." As they prepared to leave the mining camp, Little Wolf felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. They had Wilson's confession, but they still had to get him to town safely and convince Judge Harrison to halt the execution based on new evidence. The hardest part of their mission was still ahead of them, and dawn was only a few hours away. The ride back to town was the longest 30 miles of Little Wolf's life. Wilson had sobered up considerably during their conversation at the mining camp, but he remained nervous and jumpy, frequently looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Dawn was still 2 hours away when they reached the outskirts of town, but Little Wolf knew they had to move quickly. Judge Harrison lived in a modest house on the respectable side of town, and he was not happy about being awakened at 4 in the morning by 3 Apache men and a drunken drifter. He answered his door in a nightgown and cap, holding a lantern and looking thoroughly irritated. "This better be good," the judge growled, recognizing Little Wolf despite the early hour. "The execution is set for sunrise, and I won't tolerate any last-minute theatrics." "Your Honor, we have new evidence that proves Sam Morrison's innocence," Little Wolf said respectfully. "Evidence that wasn't available during the trial." Judge Harrison studied Wilson's haggard face and nervous demeanor. "And this man is your evidence?" "This man is Jake Wilson, the prosecution's key witness. He's prepared to admit that his testimony was false, and that he was paid by the mining company to lie under oath." The judge's expression changed from irritation to serious concern. False testimony was a grave matter, especially in a capital case. "You'd better come inside," he said grimly. In the judge's study, Wilson repeated his confession with shaking hands and a voice that grew stronger as he spoke. He admitted to taking money from James Patterson, to lying about witnessing the murder, and to not even being in the territory when Charles Brennan was killed. Judge Harrison listened without interruption, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions that demonstrated his legal experience. When Wilson finished, the judge sat back in his chair and considered the implications. "This is a serious allegation," Judge Harrison said finally. "If true, it suggests a conspiracy to commit perjury and obstruct justice. But it's also the word of a confessed liar against respected business interests." "There's more, Your Honor," Little Wolf said, producing a packet of papers he'd prepared during the night. "We have evidence of Wilson's meetings with mining company officials, payments made to him in cash, and a pattern of witness intimidation throughout the case." The judge examined the documents carefully. Most were statements from townspeople who had observed Wilson's suspicious activities, circumstantial but compelling when taken together. "Even if I accept this evidence," Judge Harrison said, "I can't simply overturn a jury verdict based on one witness's change of heart. The law requires proper procedures, appeals processes, formal hearings." Little Wolf felt his heart sink. He'd hoped that Wilson's confession would be enough to halt the execution, but he could see that the judge was bound by legal procedures that couldn't be rushed. "Your Honor," Little Wolf said desperately, "surely you have the authority to postpone an execution if new evidence raises doubts about the conviction." "I do," the judge admitted, "but I need more than just this man's confession. I need corroborating evidence that would convince a reasonable person of Morrison's innocence." That's when Standing Bear spoke up. "What about the real killer?" Everyone turned to look at him. Standing Bear had been quiet throughout Wilson's confession, but now he had everyone's attention. Wilson said Patterson told him it didn't matter who really killed Brennan. Standing Bear continued, "But someone did kill him. And if the mining company was willing to pay for false testimony, maybe they were also willing to pay for the murder itself." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Do you have evidence pointing to the real killer?" "I might," Standing Bear said. "During my time on the reservation, I heard stories about a gunman named Tom Hawkins who'd been doing work for the mining companies. Hawkins is Pete Hawkins' younger brother. Pete was one of Sam's neighbors who sold his ranch to the mining company." Little Wolf felt a spark of recognition. Pete Hawkins had been one of the men who'd confronted Sam at his ranch, demanding that he turn over the Apache boys. If Pete's brother was working as an enforcer for the mining companies, it would fit the pattern of corruption they'd been uncovering. "Where is this Tom Hawkins now?" Judge Harrison asked. "That's what we need to find out," Standing Bear replied. "But if he's the real killer, he might still have evidence linking him to the crime." The judge checked his pocket watch. "Gentlemen, it's nearly 5:30. The execution is scheduled for sunrise at 6:15. Even if this Hawkins fellow exists, and even if we can find him, there isn't enough time to conduct a proper investigation. Then postpone the execution," Little Wolf pleaded. "Give us 24 hours to find the real killer and present a complete case." Judge Harrison considered this request carefully. Postponing an execution was a serious decision that would generate political pressure from the mining companies and criticism from law and order advocates throughout the territory. "I'll give you until noon today," the judge said finally. "If you can bring me Tom Hawkins and evidence linking him to Brennan's murder, I'll consider reopening the case. If not, the execution proceeds as scheduled." It wasn't much time, but it was better than nothing. The three brothers and Wilson left the judge's house as the first light of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky. They had less than 7 hours to find a killer and prove Sam Morrison's innocence. Crow Feather had been thinking about the problem while the others talked with the judge. If Tom Hawkins killed Brennan, he would have needed to dispose of the murder weapon somewhere safe. Somewhere he could retrieve it later if necessary, but where it wouldn't be found accidentally. "Where would you hide a gun if you were in his situation?" Little Wolf asked. "Somewhere on his brother's property," Crow Feather replied. "Pete sold his ranch to the mining company, but he probably kept a house in town. Family property would be the safest hiding place." They rode to Pete Hawkins' house as the sun rose over the desert hills surrounding town. Pete was feeding chickens in his backyard when they arrived, and his face darkened with suspicion when he recognized the Morrison boys. "What do you want?" Pete demanded. "Ain't you caused enough trouble for decent folks?" "We're looking for your brother Tom," Little Wolf said. "We need to ask him some questions about Charles Brennan's murder." Pete's expression changed from suspicion to fear. "Tom ain't here. Ain't seen him in weeks. But you know why we're looking for him, don't you?" Standing Bear said quietly. Pete looked around nervously as if checking to see whether anyone else was listening. "I don't know nothing about no murder," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your brother's been working for the mining company," Little Wolf said. "We know he's been doing their dirty work, and we know he killed Charles Brennan on their orders." "You can't prove nothing," Pete replied, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Crow Feather had been studying the layout of Pete's property while the others talked. His mechanical mind was always analyzing how things worked, and he'd noticed something interesting about the well in Pete's backyard. "That's a new rope on your well," Crow Feather observed. "And the pulley looks like it's been used recently, even though the well's been dry for years." Pete's face went pale. "So what? Man's got a right to maintain his property." But Crow Feather was already walking toward the well, examining the rope and pulley system with the expertise of someone who understood machinery. "This rope's been weighted down with something heavy," he said. "Something that was lowered into the well and then pulled back up recently." Standing Bear joined his brother at the well. "Help me with this," he said, and together they began hauling up the rope. "You got no right," Pete shouted, but he made no move to stop them. His guilt was written across his face as clearly as words on a page. At the end of the rope was a canvas bag, waterproofed and weighted with rocks. Inside the bag, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a rifle that matched the caliber of the bullet that had killed Charles Brennan. More importantly, carved into the wooden stock were the initials Th. Tom Hawkins. Wilson examined the weapon with the knowledge of a man who'd spent years around firearms. "This rifle's been fired recently," he said. "You can smell the gunpowder residue even through the oil." Little Wolf felt a surge of triumph, but they still needed Tom Hawkins himself. "Where is your brother, Pete? We know you've been in contact with him." Pete Hawkins looked at the rifle, then at the determined faces of the three Morrison brothers. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "He's hiding at the old mine shaft about 5 miles north of here," Pete said quietly. "Been there since right after the trial ended. Tom was supposed to leave the territory after Morrison was executed, but he's been drinking heavy and talking crazy.
Keeps saying he never meant to kill nobody, that Patterson told him it would just be a warning." The pieces were falling into place.
The mining company had hired Tom Hawkins to threaten or intimidate Charles Brennan, but the situation had gotten out of hand and ended in murder. Rather than admit their role in the killing, they decided to frame Sam Morrison and use false testimony to ensure his conviction. "We need Tom to confess," Little Wolf said. "Will he talk to us?" "He might," Pete replied. "He's been carrying a load of guilt since it happened, and he's scared of what Patterson might do to keep him quiet permanently."